Happy Sabbath from warm and sultry Burlington, Washington. Probably not sultry, but we have the windows and closed, the fans off here. Missing all of the church family back in Sitka, Alaska, and today's sermon is from the book of Hebrews. And I wish I were there. I wish we could meet physically again, but I think you're having another Zoom church, and wish we could be with you. Today we'll be looking at the promised rest found in Hebrews chapters 3 and 4. I have several Bible apps on my phone. Each one has its own purpose and function. When I want to listen to the Bible read to me, there's an app for that, as they say. I use the Alexander Scourby Audio Bible because it has many useful features. One is that you can play the same chapter, verse, or playlist over and over again and loop it. So it's good for memorization. It also has a timer feature that I really like, and that is as you're dozing off or you wake up in the middle of the night and you would like to listen to something, but you also don't want to have to turn it off, you can set it for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and it will automatically turn off. So it has many nice features. And I was listening to Hebrews while randomly going about my business, and was startled by the phrase in Hebrews 4 verse 1, which says, "Therefore, let us fear." And this is not what we're used to hearing. God said to Abraham, "Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. Fear not, Hagar, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Fear not, Isaac, for I am with thee. Fear not, Jacob, to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation." Moses told the people of Israel, "Fear not, neither be discouraged." And the Lord said unto Joshua, "Fear not, neither be thou dismayed." When the angel came to the shepherds in Bethlehem, and the glory of the Lord shone round about, the first words spoken to the trembling shepherds were, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people." When the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water in the fourth watch of the night, they were terrified. Jesus said to them, "It is I. Be not afraid." That's what we're used to reading. Fear not, be not afraid. So it was somewhat startling to read or to hear read, as only Alexander Scourby can, Hebrews 4 verse 1. "Therefore, let us fear." Remembering the principle that when we see the word "therefore," we should ask what it is there for, let's look at what Paul is talking about that brought him to such a fearful conclusion. Paul quotes Psalm 95, "Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works 40 years. Therefore I was angry with that generation, and said, They always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." Hebrews 4:1, "Therefore, let us fear." The full verse reads, "Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear, lest any of you seem to have come short of it." The history of Israel is a lesson book in the plan of salvation. God called the Israelites out of Egypt, saved them from their life of slavery, gave them his law, and led them to the promised land of Canaan. In the same way, God calls us out of the world, saves us from the slavery of sinful habits, gives us his law and the principles of his kingdom, and leads us to the heavenly Canaan, type and antitype. Now in Hebrews 3, we are reminded that a whole generation died at the borders of the promised land. Then Hebrews 3:19 says, "They could not enter in because of unbelief." And then continuing on with 4 verse 1, "Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear, lest any of you seem to have come short of it." Unbelief kept an entire generation out of Canaan. They did not believe the promises, specifically the promise of rest. Now let's read what Paul says, picking up in Hebrews 3 verse 12 to the end of the chapter. "Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ, if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said, Today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in their rebellion. For who, having heard, rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt, led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? But to those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter in, because of unbelief. They failed at the borders of Canaan, because of unbelief. James tells us that even the devils believe and tremble. But these did not even believe. It reminds me of God's warning in Zephaniah 1:12. And it shall come to pass at that time that I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and punish the men who are settled in complacency, who say in their heart, The Lord will not do good, nor will he do evil. They do not believe God's word. They write off the promises of salvation, and ignore the warnings of judgment. The Lord will not do good, they say, nor will he do evil. God will neither save nor punish. We're on our own down here. Every man for himself. Like the people in the time of Ezekiel, they say, The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. Back to Hebrews 3:19. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. And the next verse, Hebrews 4:1, Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear, lest any of you seem to have come short of it. Later in verse 11 we read, Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. The Berean Study Bible reads, Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest. In the King James Version, reading Hebrews 4:11, Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest. To summarize where we are thus far, God promised rest to the Israelites, but they were unable to enter into that rest because of unbelief. Therefore, we are to be afraid of missing out on the rest that is promised to us. In fact, we should strive diligently and even labor in order to enter in to the promised rest. Let's read what Paul says about it. Hebrews 4, starting with verse 2. For indeed the gospel was preached to us as well as to them. For the word which they heard did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in those who heard it. For we who have believed do enter that rest, as he has said, So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this place, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience, again he designates a certain day, saying in David, Today, after such a long time as it has been, said, Today if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterward have spoken of another day. There remains therefore a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works, as God did from his. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. Paul here is speaking of the seventh-day Sabbath. In fact, let's take a closer look. In verse 4, Paul mentions the seventh-day rest of creation. And then in verse 9 says that there remains a rest for God's people. The Greek word for rest in verse 9 is sabbatismos. And all the Greek versions, those of you that are familiar with the King James versus the other versions and Textus Receptus, and whether it's that or other manuscripts, various Greek manuscripts that were translated, all of them agree on this verse. The Greek word for rest in all of the manuscripts is sabbatismos, and it means a keeping of the Sabbath or a Sabbath rest. In fact, that is how the verse is translated in many versions. The NIV says, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. The English Standard Version, which I think Keith uses. Hi, Keith. Yeah, I miss you guys. I really do. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. The Berean Study Bible reads, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. The NASB, that prides itself on being, quote, and I'm quoting from the preface or introduction to the NASB Bible, it says that they seek to be, quote, true to the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And they translate it as, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. The Net Bible is famous for its copious translation notes. And if you access it online for free, the Net Bible. In fact, there are over 60,000 translation notes, nearly 2 notes for every verse in the Bible. And it's fascinating to read the thought process that the translators used as they struggle over various translation issues in various verses. But there are no notes for Hebrews 4:9. Although there are over 60,000 translation notes in the whole Bible, they don't have a translation note for this verse. The team of scholars who translated the Net Bible thought that the original Greek was very clear and didn't need any translation notes. Here's how they translate the verse. Consequently, a Sabbath rest remains for the people of God. A Sabbath rest that we are to fear missing out on and that we are to labor to enter. The 4th commandment reads, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It's the only commandment that we're told to remember anything. And it is the commandment that is most often forgotten or ignored. We are told that because God worked in creating the world for 6 days and rested on the 7th day, we are also to work 6 days and rest on the 7th day. And that there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Paul tells us in Hebrews 4:9 that the Saturday Sabbath rest established at creation and commanded at Sinai still applies to God's people today. There remains a Sabbath rest. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Verse 10, for he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works, as God did from his. And then in verse 11, we are enjoined to labor in order to enter into that rest. What does it mean to labor to enter that rest? Seems kind of like an oxymoron somehow, that they're competing against each other, rest and labor here. But we are to labor to enter into the promised rest. And I believe there are 3 meanings to this. In the 4th commandment, when it says, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God, God is teaching us that in order to keep the commandment to rest, we must first be active. If we ignore the command to do all thy work, we cannot enter into the Sabbath rest. If we are lazy or slothful or neglectful of duties that fit under the category of all thy work, we cannot enter into the Sabbath rest promised to the people of God. By resting on the Sabbath from our daily toils, we acknowledge that we are dependent on God for our daily bread. That although we have worked and done our part, we've labored and toiled, ultimately our provisions come from God. That's the first meaning, I believe, of labor. There's a second meaning of labor, In Exodus 31:13, God commands Moses, "Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you." The Sabbath is a sign of sanctification. In simpler terms, Sabbath is a monument commemorating the fact that it is God who makes us fit for heaven. Sadly, it is a monument that many are trying to tear down. The Saturday Sabbath, established at creation and commanded at Sinai, provides the balance between faith and works. We're commanded to do an abundance of good works. There are a lot of action commands in the New Testament, besides the 10 Commandments, which are still binding. The last few verses of the book of Matthew includes the command, "Go and make disciples of all nations." We're commanded to pray, to abstain from all appearance of evil, to promote peace, to pursue righteousness. There's a lot of activity that we are commanded to do. However, this activity has no saving merit. Every Saturday we are reminded that our works do not save us. We cannot rely on our merits. We cannot depend on our own righteousness. The prophet Isaiah, speaking of God's people in his day, said, "All our righteousnesses are as filthy rags." Our best works are marred with selfishness, pride, or some other sinful trait. Every Saturday we are reminded that it is Christ who saves us. It is Christ who purifies us. It is Christ who empowers us to live out His works of righteousness. It is Christ who gives us victory over sin. It is Christ who is our only hope. On Saturday we rest on Christ's merit. On Saturday we rest by faith that our salvation is totally dependent on Christ and not our own good works. We cannot see Christ. We can read about Him. We can read the promises of victory and promises of forgiveness, but we cannot see Him. We can, however, see our good works. We can calculate our tithes and compute our offerings. We can quantify our time in prayer and enumerate our deeds of kindness. In fact, there probably is an app for that. But these things cannot and never could and never can and never will atone for our sin, nor do they fit us for heaven. Only the righteousness of Christ can do that. And that is what the Sabbath teaches us. It is a practical lesson of the life of faith, that while we do good works, we're not dependent upon those. Our only hope of salvation is in Jesus Christ. The Sabbath teaches us to trust Christ, not only for the provisions of life, not only for salvation, which we've just mentioned, but for our entire lives. And this is the third meaning of labor and rest. The Israelites were commanded not to carry any heavy burdens on the Sabbath day. Very few have a problem with this, as we usually don't go around lugging about a knapsack. However, most of humanity carries a mental weight of worries. While we should remember to cast all our cares upon Him because He cares for us all week long, we should be casting our cares upon Him. Saturday, we are commanded to not carry any burdens. The act of casting our cares upon Christ and committing our worries into His capable hands is part of the labor necessary in order to enter into the rest that Paul says we should fear of missing out on. Faith is necessary for salvation. We are saved by grace through faith. The Israelites could not enter the land of promise because of their unbelief. They lacked faith. If we are to be saved at last, it will mean that we have a saving faith. It was not the fault of the promise that kept the Israelites out of the land of promise. The promise was true. It was a lack of faith that kept them from entering in. They were God's people, but their lack of faith kept them out. Similarly, the promised Sabbath rest can only be entered into by faith, saving faith. In Luke 18:8, Jesus raises a fearful question. When the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? Applying the corollaries found in Hebrews 4, we can rephrase the question, will the saving faith manifested in true Sabbath worship still exist in the very last days? Hebrews 4:1, therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. Verse 9, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Verse 11, let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest. Let us be diligent by doing our 6 days of labor. Let us be diligent by not relying on our own merits for salvation. Let us be diligent by casting our cares and worries on Christ, for he is able. Then let us rest on the Saturday Sabbath in faith in God's provision for our physical needs. Let us rest in faith in Christ's righteousness, our only hope for salvation. Let us rest in faith that God has a solution for all our worries. Let us rest knowing that all things work together for good to them that love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Amen.